I always believed arrogance reveals itself in small moments, but nothing prepared me for the afternoon my son-in-law, Derek, stood in my own living room and said, "You should be grateful we let you stay here, Harold," spoken with that dismissive smirk he wore like a badge of superiority. And the moment the words left his mouth, something inside me shifted, not in anger but in clarity, a clarity I hadn't felt since before my wife died 2 years ago. I remember staring at him, this 35-year-old corporate climber with expensive shoes and a cheap sense of entitlement, wondering when exactly he decided that the roof over his head was his accomplishment and not the structure I had poured my sweat, savings, and decades of careful planning into. But of course, he didn't know the truth. He didn't know that the house he lived in, the houses surrounding it, the empty lots, the renovated duplex across the street, and even the small corner store he bragged about discovering before it became trendy, were all mine, legally, quietly, deliberately mine, because back in the late 80s when property here was worthless and the city nearly condemned the block, I bought it piece by piece, believing in the long game while Derek believed only in the next thing he could claim credit for. But that morning started like many others. I woke early, made coffee in the old percolator my wife loved, and sat on the porch watching the neighborhood stretch and yawn awake, children running to school, the bakery owner sweeping his sidewalk, the mail carrier waving at me as she had every morning for 17 years. I liked being the old man everyone knew, the one who fixed things, who lent ladders, who watered neighbors' plants, and the truth is, no one here knew the extent of what I owned. Not because I was secretive, but because I didn't feel the need to announce it, because I learned long ago that quiet power lasts longer than loud bragging. My daughter Abigail married Derek 5 years ago, and at first I tried to like him, truly I did. I ignored the subtle jabs about my outdated shoes, the comments about how Abigail needed someone who could elevate her. The way he always introduced me to people as Abby's dad, he's retired now, spoken with a tone implying I had simply run out of usefulness, but Abigail loved him and I didn't want to disrupt her happiness, so I smiled, nodded, tolerated. But after my wife died, things changed. They insisted I move in with them so I wouldn't be alone. But the truth revealed itself quickly. Derek didn't want a grieving father-in-law to care for. He wanted a built-in babysitter, errand runner, handyman, and when I hesitated to watch their kids one afternoon because I had a doctor's appointment, he said, "If you lived anywhere else, we'd have to pay someone." This is helping the family, Harold, a phrase he used often, a phrase that always meant do what benefits me. I stayed quiet, partly out of guilt, partly out of grief, but mostly because I had no intention of blowing my cover, not yet. The breaking point came on the day of the conversation, as Derek called it. He stood in front of me with his arms crossed in my living room, which he had redecorated without asking a single question, removing my wife's favorite painting because it dated the space, and told me I needed to start contributing more financially if I wanted to continue living under their roof. "Times are hard, Harold," he said, pacing like a manager rehearsing for a presentation, "and Abby and I feel you've been a little complacent. You don't pay rent, you don't pay utilities, and honestly, we're stretched thin. Most people your age are in retirement homes by now. You should be grateful we let you stay." I stared at him, this man who believed kindness made him superior, this man who thought hosting me was a burden rather than the privilege he believed it to be. And I felt something like amusement flicker through me because Derek, poor short-sighted Derek, had just spoken those words while standing on flooring I had chosen and paid for 15 years ago inside a house fully owned by me, on land owned by me, on a block owned almost entirely by me. I realized then that Derek assumed I lived with them because I had no means to live elsewhere, that my simple clothes, old pickup truck, and quiet routines had convinced him I was struggling, and not the man with more assets than he could imagine. I didn't correct him, not yet. Instead, I nodded slowly and said, "I understand," because sometimes letting a man talk is the easiest way to watch him hang himself with his own rope. What he didn't know was that earlier that week, I'd met with my attorney, finalizing the documents transferring ownership of the neighborhood to a community trust upon my passing, not leaving it to Abigail and certainly not to Derek. Because over the years I'd watched him manipulate Abigail, belittle her dreams, push her into exhaustion while he pursued promotions and bragging rights. And I decided long ago that I would not leave my life's work in the hands of a man who valued nothing but his own comfort. Still, I didn't expect his audacity to escalate so quickly. That evening, Abigail came home tired from work, still in her nurse scrubs, and before she could even set down her bag, Derek said to her, "We talked to your dad today. I told him it's time he starts paying rent. He's been freeloading long enough." Abigail froze, and the shock on her face was enough for me to step in, but I held back, curious what she would say first. "Derek," she whispered, "you didn't." "I did," he said proudly, "because someone had to." She looked at me with wide, apologetic eyes, but before she could speak, Derek added, "We need to be firm. If he won't pull his weight, he may need to consider alternative housing." Alternative housing, my house, my land, my neighborhood. Being evicted from property he didn't even know I owned. For the first time since my wife died, something inside me felt alive, not anger, but purpose, clarity, a gentle but firm certainty that it was time for Derek to learn the truth. Not through shouting, not through confrontation, but through revelation, measured, irrefutable, devastating revelation. I smiled calmly at him and said, "You're right, Derek, it's time we talk about who really owns what around here." And the confusion on his face was worth more than gold. Derek didn't understand the meaning behind my words, not yet, and the strange little smile I gave him clearly unsettled him, because he blinked rapidly, straightened his posture, and glanced at Abigail as though she might help decode what I meant. But she only looked tired, confused, caught between the man she married and the father she'd always trusted. Still, it wasn't the moment to reveal everything, because timing matters, impact matters, and truth, when delivered properly, is like a hammer. You get one swing, and it either cracks the whole foundation or it glances off harmlessly. So I went to my room that evening, closed the door, and pulled out the old metal lockbox my wife and I used to keep tucked under the bed. The one filled with property documents, land deeds, tax receipts, and the original yellowing newspaper clippings from the late 80s when the city declared our neighborhood a blighted district unfit for long-term investment, a designation that scared everyone away except us. I opened the box, sifted through the papers, and felt the weight of decades. The purchases made when no one else saw potential, the repairs done with my own hands, the careful planning done late at night with my wife at our kitchen table. Both of us dreaming of creating a safe, stable community even if we never said it out loud. I spent the next morning sorting the documents into a folder, not because I needed to prove anything to Derek, but because I knew a storm was coming and storms require preparedness. Sure enough, by afternoon I heard Derek pacing the hallway outside my door, muttering under his breath, sighing loudly as though practicing lines for an argument he intended to win. Finally he knocked, sharp, impatient. "Harold," he said, "we need to finish yesterday's conversation." I opened the door slowly, watching him straighten as if preparing to scold me. "I've been thinking," he continued, "and I want to approach this respectfully, but you need to understand the situation. You can't just live here for free anymore. It's not sustainable." I met his gaze, calm as a still lake, and asked, "And how much rent were you thinking of charging me, Derek?" His eyes brightened. He thought he had momentum. "Well, considering utilities, food, childcare, the whole package, I think $1,200 a month is fair, especially for a man without income." Without income, I couldn't help it. I laughed softly, not cruelly, just genuinely amused. Derek flinched, misreading it as mockery, which perhaps it was, but only because he'd built this entire script in his mind where he was the benevolent provider and I was the helpless dependent. "You find something funny," he snapped. "Just the way you assume things," I said, and his lips tightened. "I'm not assuming anything," he insisted. "You've lived here rent-free for months, you don't have a job, you don't have savings, and frankly, it's time you stopped being a burden." That word burden hit like a pebble tossed at a mountain. It bounced off harmlessly, but Abigail, who had stepped into the hallway mid-conversation, gasped. "Derek," she cried, "you can't talk to my dad like that." "Someone has to," Derek replied, irritated. "This isn't sustainable, he can't just live off us." That was enough. I walked back into my room, grabbed the folder from my desk, and returned to the hallway, setting it calmly on the console table near the staircase. "What's that?" Derek asked. "Perspective," I answered, "and the truth you've been missing." I flipped open the folder and pulled out the first deed. "Do you recognize this address?" Derek squinted at the paper. That's this house." "Yes," I said. "Purchased by me in 1988 for $17,000 after the previous owner walked away from it." I laid down another deed. "This one is for the duplex across the street." Another. "This is for the rental on the corner." Another. "This one is for the abandoned lot the city auctioned in '97. One by one, I laid out 18 separate deeds, the entire hallway table covered edge to edge with documents showing that I, not Derek, not Abigail, not some imaginary landlord he conjured in his mind, owned nearly the entire block. Derek stared, pupils narrowing, color draining from his face. What is all this?" he whispered. Abigail covered her mouth, eyes wide. "Dad, you bought all these." "Your father bought these," I corrected gently. "And your mother convinced me to keep buying even when we barely had enough to fix the roof. She believed in this street, in its people." Derek shook his head slowly, disbelief shaking through him like a tremor. No, this isn't possible. If you owned all this, why live like this?" "Like what?" I asked. "Like a simple man," he stuttered, unable to articulate the insult. "I mean, why not upgrade? Why not profit? Why not?" "'Cause," I interrupted, "not everyone measures success in granite countertops and imported fixtures. Some of us measure it in stability, in community, in watching families thrive in homes they can actually afford." He swallowed hard. "You let me believe you needed us." "I never said I needed you," I corrected. "You assumed it, and you assumed wrong." Abigail stepped forward, touching one of the deeds as though needing to feel the paper to believe it was real. "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" I softened. "Because people act differently when they know what you have. And I liked how the neighborhood saw me, just a helpful old man with a toolbox, not a landlord, not a man with property, just Harold." Derek looked between us, his mind racing, his narrative collapsing. "So what now?" he asked finally, voice strained. "Now," I said, "you understand that this house is not yours to lord over me, that I stay here because I choose to, not because I must." He bristled. "So what, you're kicking us out?" "No," I said softly, "but your behavior will determine whether I remain here or whether you do." Abigail gasped, hands flying to her mouth. Derek opened his in outrage, but no words came out. For once he had nothing to say. You can't do that," he stammered. "Actually," I said, "I can." I gathered the documents back into the folder, tapped them neatly into alignment. "And I will if necessary." Derek stood frozen, small, deflated, like a balloon punctured by truth. Abigail turned to him, voice trembling. "How could you treat him like that?" she whispered. "In his own home, on his own land." Derek didn't answer. He couldn't, because now he understood exactly how precarious his position was, and I wasn't done, not by a long shot. "This conversation," I said, "is only the beginning." And the look Derek gave me said he finally realized something he should have known from the start. The man he thought was powerless was actually holding every card. Derek barely slept that night. I could hear him pacing upstairs long after midnight, shoes tapping sharp, uneven rhythms across the hardwood, his breathing fast and shallow each time he passed near the railing. Every so often he'd whisper angrily to himself, rehearsing arguments, trying to rebuild whatever crumbling sense of power he believed he had, but no matter how many times he paced, he couldn't change the truth sitting quietly inside the folder now locked in my desk drawer. Meanwhile, Abigail knocked softly on my door around 10, her voice small as she asked, "Dad, can we talk?" And when she came in, she looked like a woman torn between two worlds, her father's truth and her husband's pride, and I hated that she was stuck there at all. She sat on the edge of my bed like she did when she was 10 and afraid of thunderstorms. "Why didn't you tell me you owned everything?" she asked, voice soft, cracking only a little. "I would have, I don't know, understood you better." I exhaled slowly, choosing words carefully. "Because you were building your own life," I told her. "I didn't want my choices to shape your relationship or your marriage. Money changes people, it changes expectations, it changes how they love. I wanted you to love and be loved without any of that hanging over you." She rubbed her eyes, nodding slowly, absorbing each syllable. "And Derek," she asked finally, voice tightening, "did you hide it because you didn't trust him?" That question sat between us like a stone, heavy and waiting. "I hid it," I said gently, "because I needed to see who he was when he thought I had nothing to offer him." She inhaled sharply, understanding hitting her like a wave, because Derek had shown exactly who he was, a man who measured worth by usefulness, generosity by return, and respect by leverage. Abigail leaned her head against my shoulder, whispering, "I'm sorry he talked to you that way." "You're not responsible for his choices," I told her. "Only he is." She left my room that night quieter, different, as though her world had shifted its center of gravity. The next morning, Derek avoided me entirely, no greeting, no eye contact, no fake pleasantries. He walked through the house stiffly like a man navigating a battlefield instead of a kitchen. He slammed the fridge door, dropped keys, muttered curses under his breath, but he never looked my way. It would have been funny if it weren't so predictable. But Derek wasn't the kind of man who let humiliation sit quietly. He needed to reclaim control, restore his imagined hierarchy, and by noon that day, he had already begun making calls to whom I wasn't sure, but he paced with his phone to his ear, voice low but heated, phrases drifting down the hallway. "He's bluffing, old records, can't be legal, property taxes, I'm telling you, something's off." He may as well have been chewing on aluminum foil with how tense his jaw looked, but fate has a way of accelerating certain truths. That afternoon, while Derek stewed and schemed, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. Abigail peered through the window and gasped. "Daddy, is that Ms. Cleary?" Her voice wavered between confusion and awe. Because yes, Margaret Cleary, the director of the county's Housing and Land Use Division, stepped out of the SUV carrying a briefcase and wearing her unmistakable gray suit, the one she always wore when something official was about to occur. Derek, who had been standing by the window on a phone call, froze mid-sentence. "I have to call you back," he stuttered, hanging up as Ms. Cleary approached the front door with calm authority. When I opened it, she shook my hand warmly. "Harold," she said, "sorry to drop in unannounced, thought it was better to speak privately." "Of course," I said, stepping aside. "Come in." Derek's eyes darted between us like a trapped animal. Who is this?" he asked. "This," Ms. Cleary said politely but coolly, "is a conversation for the property owner." Derek puffed up immediately. "Then you should be speaking to me." "No," she interrupted, not unkindly but firmly, "I should not." She turned back to me. "We've completed processing the documents for the community trust transfer. Just needed a few signatures and final clarifications about how you want the long-term protections structured." The color drained from Derek's face so fast I worried he'd faint. He blinked like a man slapped in the soul. "See community trust," he croaked. "Transfer?" "Yes," Ms. Cleary replied. "Mr. Lewis's properties will eventually move under the stewardship of the Hawthorne Community Trust." "What?" Derek gasped. "All of them, all 18, she confirmed. Derek swayed. Abigail stared at me, stunned. "Dad," she whispered, you're giving everything away." "Not away," I corrected softly. "Forward." Ms. Cleary nodded. "And in doing so, Mr. Lewis is creating the largest single-family-to-community land donation the city has seen in 30 years. Derek made a choking sound. "Donation? You can't donate our inheritance." His voice cracked into a shriek. This is insane. You can't do that." "Actually," Ms. Cleary said, "he can. He owns the properties outright." Derek turned to Abigail, wild-eyed. "Say something, this is your father, he can't just take our future away." Abigail stared at him, her expression colder than I'd seen since she was a child learning the consequences of lying. "Our future," she repeated. "You mean your future?" Derek pointed at me, shaking. "You're ruining our life, you owe us." "I owe you nothing," I said calmly. Derek's fists balled. "You're doing this out of spite, punishing me because I asked you to pay rent." "You asked me to pay rent," I said, "in my own house on my own land, with the arrogance of a man who believed generosity was a debt owed." Silence stretched thick across the room. Derek gulped air like he'd forgotten how to breathe. "This isn't happening," he whispered. "This can't be happening." But oh, it was, and it was only going to get worse for him. Because Ms. Cleary handed me a folder containing the updated survey maps, and when I opened it, Derek really saw the scope of the neighborhood, nearly the entire block shaded in blue labeled Lewis Holdings. "You had no idea," she said quietly to him, not mocking, just factual. "No idea how much this man has done for your community." Derek sank onto the couch, hands shaking. "So what happens now?" he whispered. I closed the folder. "Now," I said, "you learn the difference between entitlement and gratitude." He stared at me with a mixture of disbelief, humiliation, and fear, and it hit him then not only did he not control me, he didn't control anything at all. Derek didn't leave the couch for almost 10 minutes after Miss Cleary left. He sat hunched forward with his elbows on his knees, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white, breathing unevenly like a man watching his entire life tilt off its axis in slow motion. And Abigail stood near the doorway with her arms folded, torn somewhere between anger and heartbreak as she watched her husband unravel. I stayed quiet, letting the weight of reality settle over the room, letting Derek truly see that nothing he had assumed about power, control, or ownership was ever real to begin with. Finally, Derek lifted his head, and when he spoke, the bravado had drained from his voice entirely. Why would you do this?" he asked, staring at me as if trying to decipher a language he'd never learned. "Why give everything away? Why ruin our future?" The word R made Abigail flinch. She rubbed her temples like she suddenly felt dizzy. I lowered myself into the chair across from him. "Your future," I said gently, "is something I've never tried to take from you, but your entitlement to my future, my work, my choices, my legacy is something I am no longer willing to tolerate." Derek looked like he might argue, but nothing came out. His mouth opened, then closed, a man out of rehearsed lines. "I wasn't trying to be ungrateful," he finally muttered. I thought you living with us meant you needed us." "I chose to live here," I corrected softly. "There's a difference." Abigail let out a slow, pained breath. "Derek," she said, stepping closer, "you didn't treat him like family, you treated him like dead weight." Derek turned to her, wounded. "I thought I was doing what was fair. I thought he'd been coasting for years. I thought he needed responsibility." "Responsibility?" Abigail echoed, incredulous. "You asked him to pay rent in a house he bought on land he owns. You asked him to contribute while you had no idea how much he's contributed to this entire town." Derek winced as if physically struck. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know any of this." "You didn't ask," she replied. "You assumed." Derek stood suddenly, pacing, dragging both hands through his hair. "So what now? You want me gone? Want to kick me out? Is that it?" His voice trembled, not with anger now, but with fear. "I have nowhere to go if you pull the rug out from under me." The irony of that statement almost made me laugh. "Derek," I said quietly, "I'm not kicking anyone out, I'm not vindictive, but I will not stay in a home where I am treated like a burden, especially when the only burden here has been your pride." He froze mid-step. Abigail turned away, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve. Silence swelled thick and heavy. Derek swallowed hard, voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" "Understanding," I said. "Humility, respect for the people who made your life possible even when you didn't know it." Derek let out a breath that sounded half sob, half surrender. "I can change," he whispered. "I will change, just don't cut us out of everything. Don't give away the whole neighborhood just to prove a point." I shook my head. "You're still not hearing me. This was never about punishing you. This was about creating something that lasts." But why the community trust?" he asked desperately. "Why not just leave it to Abigail, to your family?" Abigail answered before I could. "Because he knows I would have tried to give you half," she said quietly, "and he knew you would have taken it without understanding its value." Derek's face crumpled. He sat again, head bowed, elbows on his knees. "I messed up," he whispered. "I messed up badly." I waited, letting him sit with that truth, not twisting it, not weaponizing it, just letting it land where it needed to, because acknowledgement is only meaningful when it's voluntary. After a while, he looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "What happens next?" he asked. What do we do from here?" I inhaled slowly, thinking not of punishment but of possibility. "We start with honesty," I said, "all of us." Abigail sat beside him then, not touching him but close enough to show she hadn't given up entirely. "Dad," she said, turning to me, "if you want to move out, if you want space, I understand." The thought pierced deeper than I expected. "I don't want to move out," I admitted, "not yet, but I do need this house to feel like a home, not a battleground." Derek wiped his face with his palm, nodding vigorously. "I can do that, I will do that, whatever it takes." I studied him carefully, not the loud, arrogant man he had been, but a smaller, frightened version of himself, stripped of the illusions he'd built his identity on, a man confronting the consequences of seeing the world only through what it owed him. "We'll take it one day at a time," I said finally. Abigail exhaled, shoulders softening for the first time in hours, but just as she reached for Derek's hand, there was a sudden knock at the door. All three of us jolted. Abigail frowned. Who? I already knew. I had been expecting them, just not this soon. When I opened the door, two men in crisp suits stood on the porch holding clipboards. Derek blanched at the sight of them. Abigail stepped behind me. "Mr. Lewis," the taller one asked, "we're here regarding the upcoming redevelopment of the Hawthorne district. We were informed this property belongs to the Lewis Trust estate. We'd like to review your long-term land use intentions before submitting our proposal to the council." Derek choked on air. "Redevelopment proposal? What proposal?" The man smiled politely. "Sir, the entire neighborhood is under Mr. Lewis's ownership. Any public project requires his direct approval." Derek staggered backward, gripping the edge of a chair. Wait, people in town know, they've always known." "Of course," the man said cheerfully. "He's practically a legend in the municipal records." Abigail turned slowly toward me, eyes wide. "Dad, you really own everything." "Not everything," I said with a small smile. "Just everything that mattered at the time." Derek looked as if he might faint, and that was when I realized the real reckoning hadn't even begun yet. The two men in suits stood waiting politely on the porch, their clipboards pressed neatly to their chests as if unaware that they had just detonated a bomb in my living room. Behind me, Derek let out a soft, strangled sound, somewhere between disbelief and panic, as he tried to make sense of the fact that complete strangers knew more about my financial and legal power than he ever had. I stepped outside with the men, closing the door gently behind me, not to exclude Derek, but to give him the dignity of falling apart without an audience. The agents explained the redevelopment proposal, expanding the community garden, restoring the old library, installing safer walkways. All projects I had quietly envisioned decades ago but never had the energy to fight the city over, at least not alone. Now, finally, the world seemed ready for the improvements I'd waited years to see. I told the agents I'd review the documents and be in touch. They left gratefully, relieved to have met their most important landowner, a title I had never cared to flaunt. When I returned inside, Derek was standing by the window, staring at the street with his jaw slack, Abigail beside him with one hand pressed gently to his back the way you comfort someone in shock. "You're a legend," Derek whispered hoarsely, turning toward me like he was speaking to a myth rather than a man. "People in town. Everyone knew except me. I didn't tell anyone outside of city records," I corrected softly. "But people pay attention when you help them, when you build something for the long term." Derek swallowed, and his voice cracked. "I told you that you should be grateful we let you live here." Abigail closed her eyes, shame flickering across her face. "Dad," she said quietly, "we owe you an apology, both of us." I nodded toward the couch and we all sat, not as accuser and defendants, but as a family bruised, humbled, and finally ready to speak honestly. Derek looked down at his hands, twisting his wedding ring round and round. "I grew up poor," he began softly. "I always felt like life was something I had to fight for. Nothing came easy, nothing was ever secure, so when we got this house, when things finally felt stable, I panicked at the idea of anything slipping away." I let him talk. "The truth, when it finally comes, is rarely loud. When you moved in," he continued, "I thought, no, I convinced myself that you'd become a burden, one more thing threatening what little we had, and I tried to push responsibility onto you so I wouldn't feel it on me." He looked up then, eyes red. "I treated you like you owed me something, like you were taking instead of giving." I leaned back, studying him, not the man who insulted me, not the man who tried to control the house, but a frightened child in an adult's body, finally realizing that survival isn't the same as love. "Derek," I said gently, "I never hated you. I hated the way you saw me. I hated the way you made Abigail question her loyalty, but I never wanted to punish you, not once." He wiped his eyes with the heel of his palm. Then what happens now? You're giving away the neighborhood. You're moving everything into a trust that doesn't involve me. Does that mean I'm done? Am I out of this family?" Abigail reached for his hand before I could answer. "You're my husband," she said. "That doesn't disappear because you made mistakes, but you're going to earn Dad's trust back, brick by brick." Derek nodded quickly, desperately. "I will, I promise, I'll do anything." I held up a hand. "Not anything, just the right things." And right then, as though life wanted to test his sincerity immediately, my phone buzzed on the table, an alert from the neighborhood app. The community garden's irrigation system had failed again, and volunteers were asking whether the property owner could approve emergency repairs. Abigail smiled faintly. "Dad, that's you." Derek stood abruptly. "Let me come with you," he said. "Let me help, please." Part of me hesitated, another part warmed. People don't change in speeches, they change in actions repeated until they become truth. I nodded. "All right, let's go." The three of us walked to the garden, a 10-minute stroll down the neighborhood path I helped pay to pave 15 years earlier. As we walked, people waved, greeted me by name, offered updates on the various parcels of land the trust now controlled, things Derek heard for the first time with wide, humbled eyes. At the garden, volunteers lit up when they saw me. "Mr. Lewis, thank goodness you always know what to do. We wouldn't have this place without you. Let us know how we can help with the new trust." Derek blinked rapidly, stunned by the casual reverence. "People really do know you," he whispered. "They respect you." I knelt beside the irrigation valve and explained the system to the volunteers. Derek crouched beside me, listening intently. When I handed him a wrench, he didn't flinch or posture, he just worked. For the first time since I'd known him, his ego wasn't in the room. Later, as we walked back home, he stopped suddenly. "I want to be part of this," he said. "Not the money, not the ownership, the community, the work, the things you built." Abigail looked at me, hopeful, nervous. I studied Derek again, not the man he had been, but the man he might become. "That depends on consistency," I said. "Humility, learning, showing up when no one is watching, giving without expecting anything in return." Derek nodded eagerly. "I can do that." And for the first time, I believed him. That evening, Abigail cooked dinner, something she hadn't done since the tension began, and we all ate together quietly, peacefully, almost gratefully. Afterward, Derek stayed behind to do the dishes. I heard Abigail kiss his cheek softly. Small acts, healing acts. Before bed, as I stepped out onto the porch, the distant glow of streetlights illuminated the neighborhood, the one I had protected quietly for decades, now entrusted to the future. Abigail came out beside me. "Dad, do you think he'll really change?" I looked out over the land, my land, our land. "I think he already has," I said, "and the rest time will reveal." She leaned her head on my shoulder like she used to as a girl. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up on us." I smiled. "Family isn't about ownership," I said softly. "It's about choosing to build something together." Inside, I heard Derek vacuuming the living room, not because anyone asked him to, but because now he understood what a home really meant. And for the first time in a long while, peace settled into my bones, not revenge, not vindication, just peace.